Letters from Iwo Jima movie review. So this is part of my scripted movie review series, in which I go back through my blog archives over the past 13 years and look at some of the movie reviews I've written and try to make YouTube videos out of that. I mention that because in this case, I think this is one of those movies that got a fair amount of press at the time, but then has largely been forgotten since then. Or has it? I don't know. I'm living abroad at the moment, so tell me if I'm wrong. Do people still talk about this movie, or is it largely forgotten? So this movie came out when 2006, 2007, and was a two-parter, kind of, or a companion piece. Sorry, I'm going through the history of this again under the assumption that maybe some people aren't familiar or have forgotten. There was Flags of Our Fathers, and there was Letters from Iwo Jima, each of which was a companion piece to each other. And each was portraying the Battle of Iwo Jima, but Flags of Our Fathers was from the American perspective, and Letters from Iwo Jima was from the Japanese perspective. Clint Eastwood was in charge of producing and directing these movies as well. I don't remember. It was a Clint Eastwood project, at any rate. So it's from the Japanese perspective, but it's an American film, an American-made film, which is an interesting experiment to kind of take a historical event like this, especially something like World War II, which has been mythologized as a battle of good versus evil, and to try and understand what the perspective of the opposite side was. I mean, the Japanese make some of their own films about World War II, but this was an American attempt to understand what the Japanese perspective was, which, yeah, I'll get into some of the critiques of it in a moment, maybe, but whatever you may say about it, I think it's a worthwhile project, or a worthwhile endeavor to attempt. And this got a fair amount of positive press in Japan. I was living in Japan at the time. So, yeah, I was kind of inside of Japan and kind of exposed to some of the Japanese perspective. And from kind of my Japanese friends and just kind of the general vibe I picked up, the Japanese people were very appreciative of the attempt. The order that this was released in Japan was, I believe, the reverse order of the way it was released in the U.S. In the U.S., I think the Flags of Our Fathers, the American perspective, was released first, and this was a follow-up. In Japan, this one was released first, and did quite well in Japan. According to Wikipedia, this made more money in Japan than it did in America. I didn't actually go to the theaters, but just from my video store, this was the movie that was released first in the video store, so I rented this on DVD first and didn't see Flags of Our Fathers until it came out several months later. And I watched this movie at the time with a Japanese girlfriend. We're no longer together, but this was way back in 2007, so my girlfriend at the time. And yeah, it was interesting watching this with a Japanese person because she gave me some of the Japanese perspective. Although, it's always dangerous, I do this all the time, but it's a mistake, to talk to one Japanese person and say, oh, this is what all Japanese people think. I fall into that trap a lot, but it's a mistake. So I noted down kind of some of her criticisms of the movie, which perhaps could be a Japanese perspective or perhaps could just be her perspective. Her perspective. The movie quotes from kind of letters that the soldiers are writing home. And she thought, my Japanese girlfriend, that the gushy emotional letters that the soldiers wrote home to their wives and children would have been unusual for Japanese men of that era. That was her criticism. On the other hand, someone pointed out to me, after I posted this on the blog, that this movie used as its basis some of the real-life letters that the Ken Watanabe's character, I forget his name, but the character played by Ken Watanabe had actually written in real life. So there you go. Yeah, actually, likewise, she thought Ken Watanabe's character, the general, was too much like an American manager and not like a Japanese superior. A Japanese superior apparently would not have been so concerned about morale of the men and wouldn't have needed to explain his actions to his subordinates. Especially a Japanese general in that era would have expected just blind obedience and would simply have barked out orders without explanation. Now, Ken Watanabe's character, or Watanabe Ken, it depends whether the Japanese order or the American order, had actually spent time in America. I mean, historically, this character had done this as well as that referenced in the movie. So that could have been the explanation there. But again, yeah, my Japanese girlfriend was skeptical of it. Also, the soldiers, the common soldiers talking to each other. The movie made a point of kind of showing all this soldier talk, you know, about these common soldiers just complaining to each other. Now, even though this was out of earshot of their superiors, and so would have been presumably safe, my Japanese girlfriend didn't buy it. She thought this is something American soldiers would do, kind of complain to each other, but a Japanese soldier would not have dared to complain about his superiors, even if he thought he was out of earshot. And then the last complaint from her was about the dialogue in the movie. She thought she had a hard time catching it. I mean, we were watching it and I was reading the subtitles. I spoke some Japanese and understood some Japanese, but was reliant more on the subtitles. But she was kind of listening in for the Japanese and had a hard time hearing it, and was theorizing that because this movie was made for American audiences, maybe they didn't care so much about a clear, clean Japanese pronunciation and just figured they'd subtitle everything. Although again, that's what she said. I'm reporting this with a grain of salt because this movie actually did quite well in Japan, as I mentioned earlier, in the Japanese box office. And you know, everyone was professional in this movie. They were all professionals. You know, these actors were not unknowns. These were kind of well-known Japanese actors, so like they knew presumably how to speak clearly to the camera and how to be properly mic'd and all this stuff. I don't know. Maybe our TV just wasn't loud enough, or I don't know. I don't know. This is completely unscientific. I'm just kind of going off the perspective of one Japanese person I talked to instead of trying to do a scientific poll. And yet, from my own experience, not talking about the quality of the sound, but kind of everything else, it does seem different than the way Japanese people make movies. So, for example, The Men of Yamamoto, or Yamamoto's Men, movie I reviewed previously, which was a Japanese movie that came out around the same time, which was telling a story of the war from the Japanese perspective, completely different in tone. Yeah, none of these soldiers kind of sitting around complaining like, I hate this war, blah, 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 isn't it terrible? Why are they making us do that? None of that was present in Yamamoto's Men, a Japanese movie. In Yamamoto's Men, the Japanese movie, the soldiers were portrayed as being blindly patriotic and like full of enthusiasm. Now, there was arguably, or arguably not, depending on what side you take about the controversy about Yamamoto's Men, something I went into a previous video. arguably an undertone throughout the movie criticizing that blind patriotism, subtly criticizing it. But it was never portrayed that the Japanese soldiers were at all disillusioned or griping about the war in the movie that the Japanese made. And as far as I can tell from what little I've seen of other Japanese cinema, I think this is kind of the trend. So, arguably, Letters from Iwo Jima is a movie from the Japanese perspective, but a movie the Japanese themselves would never have made about the war. Or I don't know, tell me if I'm getting it wrong. But that's my impression. Which, I don't know, invalidates it, or maybe doesn't completely invalidate it. I mean, the film still had a strong message, even if it wouldn't be the same way the Japanese people would tell their own story. As an American movie, the movie still had a strong message of trying to humanize the enemy. Like, sure, this is the enemy, but they're humans just like us. And I think that's a message kind of worth telling. Moving away from the message now and just talking about the experience of watching it, I thought it was a bit long to sit through. I mean, I appreciate what they were trying to do, but I got a little bit bored at points and thought maybe it could have been shorter or could have spent some more time in the editing room. But on the whole, it's worth seeing. And yeah, that's really all I have to say about this one. Let me know if anyone has kind of any more insight into what a Japanese perspective on this movie would be. But yeah, that's the impression I got.